give you a little overview of what's coming up. Next podcast is an alarming one, which is nuclear war inevitable? I interviewed Alexander Markovsky, a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, a think tank that examines national security, etc. He's the author of Anatomy of a Bolshevik and Liberal Bolshevism. America did not defeat communism, she adopted it. Markovsky knows what's going on. The two of us discuss, is nuclear war inevitable? It's actually soberingly frightening in some ways. You can't laugh it off. I saw his article in the American Thinker. Whether Putin has drawn out his saber without the need may be debatable, he writes, but the geopolitical reality is that he will not pull it back without glory, whatever the cost. Putin, who revived Russia and rebuilt its economy from the ruins of the collapsed Soviet Union, cannot permit his odyssey to end in the country's dissolution. On the other side of this Ukrainian confrontation, he writes, is President Biden, who cannot afford the humiliation of another defeat after the disastrous retreat from Afghanistan. He also needs a victory at any cost. He writes, Mr. Markovsky does, well, I'm not going to give you the whole podcast. It's coming up. You're going to love it. And it's sobering for those of you who are sober. Okay. Join me and discusses the continued escalation of the Ukrainian conflict. We discuss Putin's existential threat from both East and West, why NATO has become increasingly militant. That's strange, isn't it? Liberal NATO, first run by lesbians in the Nordic countries, the same lesbians who let in Muslims and other terrorists into their countries in order to defeat the white males of their own country, are suddenly the biggest warmongers on the planet. We'll also discuss the truth about Ukraine's historic borders, what Putin will do after the Wagner shakeup. You're going to love Savage and Markovsky's evaluation of the greatest threat to humanity in our lifetime. And we seem to have drunk lunatics here in America cheering on war without any talk of peace. I know you're going to love it. It's on Tuesday's Michael Savage podcast. I do the best I can for you, and I hope you continue to support the program. Over the weekend, I didn't party. For some reason, everyone was enjoying themselves. I couldn't. What I was doing was studying the news, and I tweeted all over the map, I must tell you. So I'm going to read you some of the tweets. Some of them are related to this podcast, some are not. What triggered me was my reading that we were sending cluster bombs to little Zelensky, the poison dwarf. Why in the world would we send cluster bombs to Zelensky, the madman? Why? Now, I know Russia uses them. Does that mean that we should now escalate the use of these horrendous weapons, which will poison the earth for decades to come? Are you people insane? I never saw anything like this madness. Biden sending to Ukraine cluster bombs simply to mutilate Russians. And I tweeted, a convention banning the use of cluster bombs has been joined by more than 120 countries, which agreed to not use, produce, transfer, or stockpile the weapons and to clear them after they have been used. And yet the lunatic loser, Biden, agreed to send them to Ukraine to kill Russians. Now, this is the same president who was seen on a beach, stumbling around in the hot sand over the weekend, looking like a typical, very old man who didn't know where he was. What you must know about the munitions that are being sent to Zelensky is the following. He has virtually used up almost all of our artillery shells. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Think about the damage to the earth. All of you good environmentalists who care so much about climate change. Think about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of shells that little Zelensky and the Russians have exploded over an area of the earth you don't even know where it is, most of you. Now, let's look at cluster bombs. Why are we sending them to Zelensky? Because the greedy scumbags in the military industrial complex here in America, the greediest scumbags on the planet, these are demons, know that these are artillery shells that we can't use. They're also almost at the end of their lifespan. So if we transfer them to Ukraine, the scumbags in the military industrial complex will get a contract from the old man who is falling apart in the White House and his college girls to make new cluster bombs with a new $1 billion contract. That's the story. Somebody tweeted this, Dr. Savage, you have 228,000 followers and very seldom have more than a few hundred responses to your tweets. Twitter is throttling your reach, something awful. Yes, they are. I'm banned, let's say shadow banned on Twitter and on Facebook. There's another crazy one. A child thinks he is a furry animal. California law dictates school must provide litter box for him in classroom. This is a true story. Nobody can believe it. Nobody can believe it, but it's true. Then I saw a ray of hope, and I tweeted this. What? The United Kingdom and Spain do not agree with Demented Joe? Will not agree to send warmonger Zelensky cluster bombs? I couldn't believe it. Breitbart.com, UK and Spain call on Biden to not send cluster bombs to Ukraine, to not send. Concerns over danger to civilians for years to come. We have lost our collective minds. I then put up a poll on my Twitter feed. Immediate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, cessation of all hostilities or endless war, peace or war. Most people, of course, on my site want peace, not war. I then tweeted this. Since World War II, cluster munitions have killed an estimated 56,500 to 86,500 civilians. They've also killed and wounded scores of American service members. Civilians, including children in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Lebanon, the Balkans, and Laos, continue to suffer from incidents involving remnants of cluster munitions. But don't tell that to Jill Biden. She's busy propping up a clearly senile husband. It's frightening, by the way. I found something else that you may be interested in. It was an obscure point I didn't know about myself. In a prisoner swap, 2,000 Ukrainians were sent to Turkey, where they were to remain until the end of the war under the Turkish president's protection. However, the poison Zelensky brought them back to Ukraine. There was no immediate official explanation of how this squared with the conditions of the exchange. You may not recall this because you didn't read about it in the old York Times. The propaganda is complete. What else did I tweet over the weekend? And I showed pictures of what cluster bombs have done to people. I said, thanks, Joe. See what liberalism has wrought while he stumbles around in the hot sand. And then something even odder happened over the weekend. Trump claimed in a speech that he could end the war with Russia in 24 hours, and the poisoned Zelensky attacked Trump, thereby spitting in the faces of 81 million Americans. And I tweeted, Zelensky, the warmonger, attacks Trump for trying to end this insanity. Look at his eyes. And I don't mean Trump's eyes. I mean Zelensky's beady eyes. We're living in a maddening time. I tweeted some other stuff you may be interested in. I put up a picture of Yenta Yellen. There she is. Look at that. Yenta Yellen bows to China. And now we know why they fear us. Take a look at the Yenta. Look at the little corned beef eater. Look at her. Go ahead. Now look what the Chinese guy is doing to her. He grabbed her wrist like he could throw her across the room like a rag doll. Look who's running the country. This is our Treasury Secretary. This Yenta couldn't run a candy store in Brooklyn in the 1950s. Look at this. Yenta Yellen bowing and kowtowing to China. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, my friends. And finally, this morning, I found something in the Jerusalem Post that rang a bell with me, and that is this one. We'll focus on the Liberty Bell and my beautiful face. And I found this from someone who wrote this quote now, quote now. Ukraine is one of the most anti Semitic places in the world. To escape the pogroms from Ukrainians and Russians, someone wrote, their grandparents and my father emigrated to the United States in 1912. It's no surprise that Ukraine has voted 90% of the time in the United Nations, first of all, against Israel. The reason is with Muslim population on their borders, Ukrainians are even more anti-Semitic than maybe even the Poles, he wrote. Babi Yar just didn't happen without Ukrainian assistance and help. Lest anyone forget, a majority of the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis as liberators in 1942, unquote. I know you don't understand this, most of you, because you have come to think that Zelensky is some heroic Jew. I'll explain that in another time. I don't have the desire right now to go into the issue of Jewishness and not Jewishness. It's not for me to judge. Again, the podcast on Tuesday is nuclear war inevitable? I pray to God that Mr. Markovsky is wrong. And now I will tell you that there's such bad news out there, I won't even bother reading it to you. I know most people have turned off from the news. They won't even look at it. NATO gathers as war hits 500 days. This is the Drudge Report. Hungary, Turkey threaten unity. Weapons stockpile shrink. Zelensky to visit the summit. Will he wear a clean undershirt? Will he wear a new undershirt? You know, he has an outfit that mimics in a strange way that of Fidel Castro. Always the war hero. Always as though he just came back from the front lines where he was commanding his troops. My friends, we're living in crazy times, crazier than ever. Perhaps the craziest times in the history of the world. And it all happened with only a few short years of the dictatorship known as the Biden administration. I could say pray for America, but I think God has left the theater. So settle back and get ready for tomorrow's podcast. It's a real cheerful title, which is nuclear war inevitable? Thank you for listening. Tap, tap.